When it comes to generating guaranteed income in retirement, we do have a lot of options, and they all have pros and cons. One of them is a tips ladder. It's gotten a lot of attention lately, particularly with real yields on tips fairly high, at least based on historical standards. And so what I thought I would do in this video is talk about the pros and cons of building a tips ladder in retirement. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at two very different ways to think about how you might use a tips ladder in retirement. And then we're going to compare those options to other alternatives. For example, just keeping your money in a 60-40 or 70-30 portfolio and taking withdrawals, or possibly buying an immediate income annuity. So we're going to look at those two options in two different scenarios for tips ladder. I'm going to show you some tools, some articles. As always, I'll link to everything below the video. So scenario one is, I think, a sort of fairly straightforward approach to tips ladders. And it's to say, look, you've got Social Security, maybe you have some other sources of income, guaranteed income, but from your investments, let's just assume for our sake, you need to generate, we'll just say another $25,000 a year in retirement. Can we generate that from a tips ladder, and how would that work, and what would be the pros and cons? So let's dive right in. The first thing I want to show you, again, I'll link to everything, is tipsladder.com. We've talked about this tool in the past. It's been redesigned, but if I were going to build a tips ladder, this would be the starting point. And they have an estimate feature. This is where I'd go. And here's what we can do. We can first set the time that we want this tips ladder to generate income for us. So let's assume we're 65. We want the money, we'll say starting next year. We're in November of 24. And so we'll be 65 next year. We'll assume a 30-year retirement. That takes us out to 2054. We'll be 95 then. And again, we can set the amount of income we need. I just assume 25,000. Use the arrow keys to dial that in. There it is. And so this immediately tells us some important things. The first is that it's going to cost us to buy all of the individual tips bonds that we need just under $570,000. Now that number is important. I want to bring it over here. I think I might already have it in there. I do. 569,192. We're going to come back to this. But what this is if we wanted to take that money and just buy an immediate annuity, what would we get under those circumstances? We'll come back to that in a minute. But that's what it would cost us for this tips ladder. And we're actually doing better than the 4% rule. We'll be able to spend 4.5% of this amount in year one, and then that will get adjusted for inflation because, as you know, tips protect us against inflation. Again, this assumes we hold each of the individual bonds that we would need to buy until maturity. All right. So then we can actually look at this ladder, and it pulls up a summary here, but we can actually look at what's called the purchase list, and it lays out exactly what tips we need to buy. They're identified by this number. It's called a CUSIP number, and how many bonds we need to buy of each, the quantity. Now, generally bonds are sold in increments of 1,000. It can be a little bit higher or lower based on whether it's sold at a premium or a discount. And with tips, you also have the inflation adjusted principle. It gets adjusted for inflation. So you can see over here the net purchase cost of each of these tips that we need to buy. All the way down, we total it all up, we get our $569,000 number. And buying these is actually easier than it may seem. If we click on the link, it takes us to Treasury Direct, and this gives us information about, in this case, this particular tip, this CUSIP number, as I mentioned. It's the same number in the link here, all right? And we can actually use this number at our favorite broker and say, okay, we want to buy that specific tip. And let's see here, I'll put it in this is just Fidelity. You don't have to use Fidelity. If we search this tip, here it is. This is the tip that's related to this specific CUSIP number, and we can buy it in quantity. In this case, we'd go back here and say, okay, we need 10 of them. And you'd put in an order for 10 of this particular security, and you'd go all the way down the list. And once you got done, yeah, it's a bit of work to buy each of these. Presumably, you're buying these in a retirement account. So I wouldn't recommend this in a taxable account, but let's assume you've got, in this case, $570,000 in an IRA. And you could, buy each of these in the quantities that they have for each of them. And you've got your tips ladder. And each year you will get income both from interest from all of the tips, as well as any of the individual bonds that happen to mature in that year. And in fact, in the one that we were looking at, we can see it was actually issued all the way back in 2005, but it was a 20-year security term, 20 years, 6 months, and it matures in January of next year. So you'd get the principal back plus any interest that you're earning on the other tips for next year. And that's how you would generate your annual income from this tips ladder. So now the question is, what are the pros and cons and how should we think about this? So definitely some advantages. One is tips are about as guaranteed an investment as we can have. They're backed by the United States government. That's one. Two, they're protected from inflation. There's an inflation adjustment that is made for these types of bonds, tips, and so you're protected from inflation. So that's all really good. And as you saw, it's not really that hard to build a tips ladder thanks to the tools that we have available to us. And you can put the CUSIP number into your favorite broker and buy them. It's not that difficult, and your broker can help you if you want help building it. So that it's not hard to build. But there are some potential disadvantages, both when we compare it to just a standard, say, 60-40 or 70-30 portfolio, and maybe when we compare it to an annuity. So what are those? Well, at the end of the 30-year period, assuming you've spent all of the $25,000 a year that you've been receiving on an inflation-adjusted basis, you're out of money. It's all gone. You've spent it all. Now, may not be a problem, particularly if you don't live 30 years. But, in the case of just using a regular, say, 60-40 or 70-30 portfolio, and even assuming a 4.5% withdrawal rate from that portfolio adjusted for inflation, in most cases, after 30 years, you'll have money left over. And in fact, most of the time, you'll have a lot of money left over. Of course, there's no guarantee. And that gets us back to tips ladder and why some people prefer it. It's about as guaranteed as you can get. Yes, there's absolutely no potential upside with a tips ladder. You won't be pleasantly surprised at the end of 30 years, assuming you're spending your 4.5% adjusted for inflation, to say, oh, look, I've got $1 million left over. That will never happen. So there is absolutely no potential upside to a tips ladder, but barring a complete catastrophe in the world as we know it, there's no downside either. But you have to keep that in mind. It's part of the pros and cons of a tips ladder versus just a standard retirement portfolio and taking withdrawals and adjusting them for inflation. That gives you the potential for a really bad outcome, but also the potential for a much, much better outcome. Now, how should we think about this tips ladder in relation to an annuity? Well, let's go back to that annuity calculator. And let's see, what else do I have to assume? I want to assume this person is 65, so I think that's 59, right? If I'm doing my math right, it'll be close. 59, we'll just say there, we'll assume it's male. Obviously, the state matters where you are, but I'll just pick a state. And let's assume we want this to begin January 1. And that's the amount we're going to invest, and it's just a single life for my lifetime. Obviously, you can get into more involved annuities, but we'll leave it simple, and let's see what it gives us. Okay, so we get monthly income, a single life, of $35.51 a month. Now remember, with our tips ladder, we're getting $25,000 a year, right? With this annuity, we're getting $35.51, which I'm pulling up my trusty calculator real quick, comes out to $42,600. That's a lot more money. Well, that's an advantage to an annuity, but unlike the tips ladder is adjusted for inflation because tips have that inflation adjustment, the annuity's not. And so yes, it gets you more money to begin with, but depending on how inflation turns out over time, eventually, I think it's likely that a tips ladder, because it's inflation adjusted, will do better than the annuity. The question becomes, well, when is that crossover point? And the answer is, we don't know. It's going to depend entirely on how high inflation is starting now and moving forward. And there's no way, at least in my view, to reasonably predict that number. So with annuities, you start off with more money to spend, but at some point, at least on an after inflation basis, particularly if you live 30 years, you're going to end up getting less because of the inflation, and that annuities are not adjusted for inflation. So that's one thing to keep in mind. A second thing is this. If you don't live the 30 years, let's say you pass away after 20 years, you have money left over in the tips ladder that you've not spent, that you can give to charity in your will, or maybe you give it to family members. But if you don't live the full 30 years, whatever is left over is still owned by you, and it can pass through your estate. With an annuity, and there are different riders and things you can buy that might change this, but for our purposes, just a plain vanilla annuity. Once you die, it's gone. There's nothing left to leave to your family or charity. So that's something to keep in mind. But the flip side, what if you not only live 30 years, what if you live 40 years? Well, with the tips ladder, after year 30, assuming you've spent all the money each year, there's nothing left. And so there is no sort of longevity insurance. Now, maybe you haven't used 100% of your savings. You have other money that you've invested, and that might fund those years. But it's something to keep in mind with the tips ladder. At the end of 30 years, in our example, you spent your money, it's gone. With an annuity, it really is longevity insurance. It will continue to pay you even if you live to be 120, and assuming the insurance company is still in business. That's another difference. With an annuity, the credit risk rests with the insurance company. With a tips ladder, it's the U.S. government that stands behind it. So once again, pros and cons to both approaches, and it's something that you need to think through and understand what's most important to you. Now, one last thing before we get to the second scenario is that we've sort of assumed that after Social Security and maybe a pension, you need $25,000 a year out of your investments. And we've assumed that you're going to build a tips ladder to generate that $25,000. But of course, that's not the only option. You might say, well, I need 25 a year adjusted for inflation, but maybe I'll build a tips ladder of just 10 or 15,000. I'm comfortable with that. And for the rest of the money, I'll have money left over that I just invest in my IRA, and it will cover that. The point is, this is never an all or nothing question. There are all kinds of in-betweens that we can use. We can use tips ladders for some of it. You could even, if you wanted, buy a single premium immediate annuity for some of it, and then have some in your investment account. So it's not one or the other. You can do a combination of all of these. All right, so what's the second scenario? Well, the second scenario that I think happens for a lot of folks is they don't want to build a tips ladder or think of guaranteed income for an entire retirement of, say, 30 or more years. But maybe they want some sort of guaranteed income for the early years in retirement, particularly if they won't start receiving Social Security. So maybe you retire at 62, but you're going to wait until your full retirement age, 67, to start receiving Social Security. Or maybe you retire at 65, you're going to wait till 70. And you want some guaranteed income for that 5-year period. Of course, it could be a little less or a little more. Can you use a tips ladder for that? And the answer is absolutely. Let me show you what that would look like. We can come back to this tips ladder tool, and we'll go back to the beginning. And by the way, there are a number of settings here that I haven't discussed. Alan Roth, who's a CFP, did a great article on using this particular tool. I won't go into the details. I'll leave that for you, but I will link to this excellent article below the video. All right, so what we can do here is we can say, we'll just assume it's $25,000 a year, but we'll leave it at that. But we don't need it for 30 years, right? So let's say we'll just say we're 60. We're going to retire in 5 years at 65. So we're going to retire in 2030. And we're not going to take Social Security until 70. So we only need a tips ladder for 5 years. Well, we can create that. Now we've shortened the amount of time. So of course the cost has gone way down. It's now 137, almost 38,000. Our withdrawal rate, notice, has gone way up to 18.5%. But of course, it's only for 5 years. And we can generate the ladder and go to the purchase list. And here it is. So we've got just 5 different tips in the amounts you see here. And we can build that tips ladder that covers us just for those 5 years. until we start receiving Social Security. And I think this is an excellent way to use a tips ladder if this scenario describes your situation. You again, it's guaranteed, it's adjusted for inflation, it's back, I say guaranteed, it's backed by the US government. I think that's about as guaranteed as we're going to get in this life. Again, it's much shorter of a ladder, so it's even easier to build, and you know what you're going to get. And then, of course, once that 5 years in our hypothetical ends, Social Security kicks in, and you have that form of guaranteed income. And so I think this is maybe even the kind of tips ladder that might even be more frequent than actually building out a full 30 years. Now, just like our 30-year tips ladder, you don't have to build the 5-year tips ladder with the full 25,000, right? You may say, well, I only need 15,000. I'll get the other 10,000 out of my investments, and I'm comfortable with that. So as before, it's not an all or nothing. But given that it's only 5 years in our hypothetical, maybe it's only 3 for you, or maybe it's 7. But I think it may be a little more common for folks to actually build the tips ladder with 100% of what their income needs are going to be, just because it's a shorter time period. But I want to stress it's not as if there's a right or wrong answer here. And you could do something different, maybe only funding it to cover 50 or 75% of your income and taking the rest out of what investments you have left over. So there you go. I think pretty straightforward. Some free tools that you can use to build a tips ladder if it's important to you. I'll walk through how to do it. Again, I'll link to Alan Roth's article, which goes through how to use the tips ladder tool in a little more detail. And there you go. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below the video. I'll do my best to help you out any way I can. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.